The darkest clouds. It was time for Roland to come back home. He was a young knight at the time, pushing himself really hard to become a paladin in the future. The Servant of Light. He just finished his 3-month session at Northern Peak, the highest and the coldest mountain in the country. He sat there in a deep meditative state with monks that vowed to live in silence. It calmed him down deeply. The first few days were difficult, though. In fact, they were almost painful. But whenever his mind calmed down a little bit and voices in his head faded away, he found himself extremely hesitant to leave. The very moment when he found that all the problems that ever bothered him have always been hiding behind talking heads living inside his head, when he realized that duty and troubles are a choice of the individual, he didn't feel like choosing them ever again. What's the point in being bothered if one can just sit there watching the mountains? He felt like this most of the time he spent there, not knowing what he will do when the day of his departure will finally come. But when it came, it was different. Peace did not leave his mind, but his heart led him back home. Was this a sense of honor or duty? He liked to think that. Or maybe his hidden love for blood and war. That was what he was afraid of. Not knowing which one of them it might be, he decided to follow the voice of fate. He left the monks on their peaceful mountain. When he put back his heavy armor, which now seemed to be even heavier than before, he couldn't help but wonder, what am I to these monks, watching me descending down those steps? Am I just like a cloud floating in the sky, a wind that just passes through? Thoughts like these were gently finding their own way in Roland's mind. In time, they grew larger, more complicated, flavored in emotions. It didn't take long for Roland to come back to his problems and duty of being a knight. It took him a day to get to the foot of the mountain. This was where he found his bodyguards, sent by the High Overseer Griswold to keep him safe on his way back. These bodyguards were merely boys, young folks that, not that long ago, lived and worked on a farm. Because their fathers couldn't afford to keep them, or because of the weight of the crimes they themselves committed, they ended up training to be the overseers in the future. Roland personally despised their order. From his perspective, they were nothing more than fanatic barbarians. Thugs, as they all were, now their violence served the same gods as Roland's. And yet, their vision of said gods seemed to him to be entirely different from what he believed in. Overseers lived their lives strictly disciplined. Every little piece of their existence, every tiniest movement of their limbs was under the control of holy codex, a set of rules they had to obey. And any action violating said codex has been condemned with a special dose of cruelty. Enough to say that not many of those guys ever lived long enough to grow old, and being old was not a relief either. There was no retirement from this duty other than death. If they weren't able to serve the gods, they were sent straight to them. Horrible way to live your life indeed. But these young guys were not overseers, not in their hearts at least. You could tell by the way they smiled and joked from time to time, or rather, that they did so at all. It made Roland's journey so much more bearable, putting aside their disputes about holy law and listening to their stories about heroic overseers of the past. They spent their nights under the mountain, and then continued through dark woods, part of the forest that gained its name by being gloomy at all times, regardless of the time of the year. Some said that it was the shadow of the northern peak overcasting it. Others told stories even more evil than the woods itself. Whatever the truth was, they hurried to get out of the woods as quickly as they could. And in this way, the day ended, as everything should see its end. Everything, but not the darkness of the dark woods. They spent their night just outside forest, on a small field from which they could see Urwich Castle towering above them from the high mountain range it stood on. It was a hell of a climb to get there, so they decided to spend the night on that field and go to the castle the following morning. They sang by the bonfire and danced joyfully. The fact that they will forget the sound of music and the joy of dancing made Roland a bit gloomy. But he did not let his bitterness take away the pleasure of participating in those dances with them. If this was to be one of the rare opportunities to have fun, he ought to give it to them this one last time. If only he knew how prophetic these words happened to be. It was the middle of the night when Roland woke up. It was quiet and dark. No wind blowing and not a single insect made a sound. And yet, his heart felt like it was going to explode any second. He was sweaty and breathed heavily. Managing to drag himself up, he looked around but couldn't see anything. The sky was covered in dark clouds, and there were no stars to illuminate his surroundings. No light, and no sound at all. He was on his way to become a paladin, a holy knight of the three gods, but he knew enough from his training already to realize the seriousness of the situation. He grabbed his sword from under the blanket he laid his head on, embraced it firmly into his hands, and started muttering a prayer. When he finished, he raised his sword gently, and, with that gentle movement, an equally gentle light followed, embracing his sword in its golden cloak. What he saw pierced his entire body with cold touch of fear. The young knights he travelled with lay on the grass exactly where they slept last night. For anyone else, they would look just like people in their deep sleep. But his underdeveloped paladin senses told him that it wasn't the case this time. These boys were dead. And he knew exactly what happened to them. Although his heart has been screaming for him not to do it, he took his dagger and pierced the hearts of his companions with it. Their hearts were not beating at that time, and his dagger was covered in a dense purple substance instead of their blood. They started to change, he thought. It was death magic they fell under. Roland could feel its presence strongly, and the light of his blade only made him sure of it. The light of the holy magic that Roland practiced not only illuminated the physical realm, but also shed a light on dark magic that might be present. And it was dark magic that killed them indeed. When they were asleep, they were haunted by dark spirits that lured them away from their lives and attempted to take their places. They would wake up as dark wraiths, angry knights that served only their rage. Roland wouldn't be able to face all three of them, not without being a real paladin at least. What worried Roland even more was that there was no necromancer or other practitioners of dark magic around that would cause such things to happen. At that time it became clear to him that the dark clouds above him had something to do with it. And the sky was not about to clear up anytime soon. The dark magic responsible for what happened was way more powerful than any other of its examples Roland had ever encountered. It meant that the person, or persons, that stood behind it held immense power that allowed them to haunt a large portion of the land. Maybe even large enough to reach Urwich Castle. Roland took all his possessions, put his shield on his back, and embarked on the journey towards the castle. His sword played the role of a golden guardian through this dense darkness, and his faith the only source of its glow. It felt like a dream, a nightmare to be precise, a darkness that dense and dreadful that its cold reminded him of the darkest of all stories he happened to listen to from old paladins talking to each other about their holy quests. It made him proud that such a thing happened to him, which made him think about himself as a paladin a little bit more, but also scared him deeply. In the end, scary stories do find their origins in even more scary events. Words are weak. They obscure reality, simplify it, suck all the juice out of it. Stories, including this one, are nothing like the real-life events that inspire them. But writers do their best with tools they are provided with, don't they? But Roland held no thought about stories being told and written about these events. He tried to calm his mind, but it was not even close to the state he had achieved on the northern peak. His thoughts were wild, jumping and squealing savagely like a crazy monkey trapped in a cage that is about to be sold on a busy marketplace. Roland understood that it did not matter how much the monkey would fight against the iron bars, they would never bend before her. It was better to preserve the strength. That's why he tried to let those thoughts pass, not follow them, not tire himself out with images of death and pain. He stepped carefully. The light of his sword, as redeeming as it was, still was dim and allowed him to see no further than few steps ahead. But darkness, this dim light perceived as the burning sun. All creatures that should stay dead and lost in the abyss could see him very well. Roland was aware of that, and darkness came for him in the end. He heard a sound behind him. It made him turn around, but there was nothing there. Then another next to him, like something running through the grass. Sound surrounded him, running in circles. Roland was merely a knight, but he studied dark magic thoroughly and with a strange passion. Not passion for singing or dancing, but the kind of passion one might have while reading about exterminating insects, or putting swarms of spiders on fire, or beheading your sworn enemies. He stood in one place with his sword held far away from his body. It tired his arm greatly, but in this way he could see slightly further. He knew exactly what he was dealing with. Death hounds, he murmured to himself, servants of wraths. The light of his blade made very little difference, but the undead creatures ran even more vigorously around him. Wheezing and grunting, they got louder and wilder. Impatiently hungry, Roland thought. He knew that an attack would happen at any second. With his blade ready, held out in front of him, he focused his senses. His heart slowed down a bit. He waited for a sound, one a bit closer than the others, one a bit more savage. and he heard it. He spun around rapidly. His blade struck right through a hound that tried to jump at him from behind. At that moment, another one approached from Roland's left. He managed to take the shield from his back with his left hand quick enough to protect himself from the assault. The hound struck the shield so hard that the knight almost fell over. Before it had a chance to escape, Roland righted himself and pierced its throat. There were two others to kill. Roland could hear them very well. They were more cautious, seeing their comrades slain so easily. They will attack at the same time from opposite sides, Roland thought. He had his shield on one arm and sword in the opposite hand. He kept turning around slowly to make it harder for them. They got impatient though. They jumped at him and he managed to parry one away with his shield and struck the other with his blade. But the blow wasn't as precise as it was supposed to be. The hound still lived, or rather was still powered by dark magic that imitated life. Roland could see the dog-like head filled with holes and its skin hanging from it like apples from an apple tree. It snapped its teeth trying to bite, but Roland held it away with his sword. He tried to take it back to strike again, while, at the same time, holding the creature at a distance. It took him too much time. Suddenly, he screamed. The pain was horrible and cold. Cold like a grave, some vicious thoughts informed him. It gave him more strength. He pulled away his sword, and before the hound was able to bite him, he cut off its head at one swing. Then he pierced the other hound's head, the one that was by his leg, biting it. When all four of them lay dead, Roland sat and grunted, holding the leg that was bleeding from the hound's bite. He tried to take a closer look at it, but the darkness emerging from his limb was denser than his sword was able to fight through. This wasn't the time for him to care about the wound, not only because the darkness surrounding him was likely to strike again soon. His skills were simply not suitable for this kind of damage. He needed a priest to heal it for him. And before it could be healed, the cold pain would penetrate him mercilessly. He ripped off a piece of cloth from his shirt and tied it just above the wound. That's pretty much all that he could do. It was obvious that pushing forward would be slow and hard, and it was more than likely that Urwich Castle was occupied by more death already. But that was his only chance. Therefore, not light at the end motivated him to move further, but visions of darkness that would embrace him if he wouldn't. He hobbled as much as his leg would allow. The way to Urwich Castle was uphill. All castles had been built on the tops of the mountains and hills to make it difficult to besiege. But this castle, just like any other castle, wasn't prepared for darkness that dense and dreadful. That sneaky and treacherous. "You're not helping me at all," Roland whispered to his thoughts. Their pessimism tried to get him down. Then he stopped commenting on them, realizing that it's just more thoughts whirling around together in their dramatic dance. So instead, he let them be. "You do your job, and I shall do mine," he thought to himself. Roland climbed the steep road, and they kept talking. All was in order. It felt like an eternity, but he got to the castle at last. The pain faded away a little bit, but at the price of Roland not being able to feel his leg anymore. He limped up and approached the gate. He couldn't see if there were any watchers on the wall. The light of his blade couldn't reach that far. He knocked at the gate and waited. There could have been an army of necromancers or a legion of skeletons waiting for him, but it did not matter at all. The only way forward led through the castle. That was his only chance, and he played his best game. He heard some commotions behind the gate. Then it started to open a little bit. When it opened wide enough for him to be able to squeeze through, he still couldn't see anyone or anything behind the darkness. He sighed slowly and approached it. "Cole, save me," he whispered. "He will, brother knight," a female voice replied to him, and Roland was struck by bright light. He had to cover his eyes, unable to see. "Give it a moment. Your eyes forgot the light of our God." The same voice spoke to him gently. Finally, he was able to see, and he looked around. The whole castle glimmered in a golden light, as if the darkness never happened here. And yet, this light was not visible from the outside. Roland was surrounded by 24 female knights, all smiling at him gently. A few priests that were scattered around the castle courtyard gave the light of their faith to the whole castle, freeing it from the darkness. Roland knew who these people were. "Praise be, sister," he muttered. These knights were Sword Sisters, the order of female knights. There weren't many of them, but they were regarded as the most honorable servants of Cole and one of the deadliest blades of the kingdom. "Come with us, brother. We'll have to take the darkness out of the wound that haunts you." Roland was carried by Sword Sisters that lifted him up like a boy. The pain went away almost completely. The sensation in his leg did so just as well. "How long have I slept?" Roland muttered with his eyes still closed. "It's difficult to tell time, considering circumstances," a sweet voice answered him gently. In fact, it was more than that. It was angelic, subtle and delicate. "But not more than a day. How are you feeling?" "I don't know," Roland answered while dragging himself up. "You should stay in bed if your leg is not fully healed." A cold hand touched his shoulder in a caring manner. He saw the face behind the angelic voice. It was equally beautiful and pure. "My leg." He touched his leg that was bitten. "It feels fine. We've managed to cleanse it from the dark poison that intoxicated it. Now that it's gone, you should be fine." I feel good indeed," Roland said while still investigating his leg with his hand, not trying to hide his disbelief. "That's a miracle. You are a miracle, sister." He looked at his savior, and she replied to him with a gentle smile. "Take your time, and, when you're ready, meet Sword Sister Sabira in the throne room. Danger still lurks around the castle." So Roland did take his time. He ate, bathed, and got dressed. Then he headed to see the leader of the Sword Sisters in person and discuss their current situation. Sabira sat on a throne and discussed their plan to deal with the darkness that embraced the castle and surrounding areas with 2 other Sword Sisters. She stopped upon spotting Roland approaching her. "My lady," Roland bowed before her. "Sir Roland." She and her 2 companions bowed back to him. He was surprised that they knew his name. Did he tell them that before he passed out? He didn't remember. Are you feeling better? In fact, I do, thank you. Your magic is miraculous. If I were to have no memory of recent events, I wouldn't believe that anything happened to me at all. I'm very glad to hear that. Sister Helena is our best healer. She's very talented indeed. We're very lucky to have her with us and also equally fortunate to have you. Tell us your story, Knight. Roland recounted everything. He started his story explaining his meditation practice on Northern Peak, his overseer's escort, the undead ambush, and his fight with the Death Hounds. He finished his story with him knocking at their gate. And you know what happened next way better than me. I slept for a while. I see. Sabina listened to Roland's every word, frowning, piercing him with her attentive eyes, which were the color of diamonds. She was rather small for a knight, but looked strong nonetheless. Since she happened to be a leader, Roland did not doubt her fortitude and intelligence. Sword Sisters were elite warriors, and to climb that high in their hierarchy, she would have had to prove herself more than once or twice. Her deeds had to be worthy of bard songs that certainly were sung in local taverns from time to time. Do you know what the origin of this darkness is, and what can we do about this matter? Roland asked after a long silence, not receiving any comment from Sabira. We discussed it for a while, and I have to admit we are unsure about what to do. The source of this magic, as Helena discovered, is supposed to be past the caverns north from the castle. Not that far away, if you forget the darkness. Many foul creatures lurk in it, I admit, Roland said, remaining official and serious. Yet there is nothing out there that would be able to defeat all of us. You must have at least 24 warriors here. The other two women looked at each other frowning, and then at their leader, as if Roland had said something stupid. We can't abandon this post. We expect to be raided any moment now. Raided? Roland exclaimed in disbelief. What precisely are you expecting, sisters? Death hounds at least, dear knight. Possibly more than that. Death hounds have been eliminated, sister. I killed them all and told you about it. She raised her eyebrows. You did not kill all of them, Roland. I had 3 companions, 3 overseers, and I killed 4 hounds. Due to the curse cast by dark clouds, warriors become wraiths, and each of them has a death hound assigned to them. If you did not lose any of your people, the castle should be safe. There was an awkward silence which lasted for a few moments. Then Sword Sister Sabina got up from the throne. Follow me, Sir Roland. What you will see will explain the situation better than any words I could utter. She led Roland to another room and stood by a little window. Roland approached it, then he saw it. Pile of burned bodies lying by the wall. This castle does not belong to Sword Sisters, brave knight. We were just passing through when the dark clouds covered the sky. When the knights that let us in for the night started to turn, we had to kill them all. That's horrible. Roland couldn't find any other words in his head. His heart dared not to speak. But in the tragedy of this event, there was one coincidence that ended up good. Dark magic was oriented toward male warriors, and that's why no Sword Sisters or priestesses turned. That might be the only reason for the castle to still stand in the hands of the living. When it happened, a few hounds came over, intending to join their corrupted knights. We killed them. But there are more out there. Beasts, way more intelligent than any dog could ever be, must have seen what happened. They will either think of a strategy to take us down or come back to their master that will come for the castle himself. Either way, we expect to be besieged any time now. You're waiting for your own death, then, Roland said quietly. If your plan is to wait, you will all die. If we'll leave this castle, we will die too, Sabira responded in irritation. We cannot let this rotten magic take over this place. We suspect that it might be only the beginning of a much bigger operation. So stay and defend this place, and I will go to find this necromancer. I will find the source. Sabira analyzed him without a word. Then she spoke. This sounds like madness, but it might work. All of us leaving would attract the attention of whatever lurks in the dark. But if they are really preparing to take over the castle, you might be overlooked. Yet, you lack the knowledge and power to deactivate whatever gem is the source of the magic. You cannot go alone. Then I shall go with him. Another sword sister entered the room. She was the largest woman Roland had ever seen in his life. She barely fit through the door frame. Her face was covered with scars, and there was something savage in her eyes. If not for the armor, Roland would never have guessed that she was a sword sister. Sister Theresa, with all due respect, but none of you wields light magic powerful enough to deal with the curse, even at the source itself. Then I will take Helena with me. I don't know a better mage than her. Neither do I, Sabira sounded harsh. Or a better healer. If you want to take away my best healer, you sentence all of us to die. My apologies, my lady, but if the darkness is not vanquished soon, there will be no one left to heal anyway. Her words were respectful, but they looked into each other's eyes so aggressively that it almost hurt Roland. He had to interrupt. I'm sorry for getting in the way, sister, but Sister Theresa is right. Our mission is going to be a key solution to this problem. You have to send the best of your people, or risk your ultimate failure. Sabira did not look at Roland. Instead, she looked outside, observing dark clouds visible behind the dome of light that her priestesses sustained. Priestesses were no knights, but they were part of the order nonetheless. A vision of them all falling before dark forces saddened her deeply. They will not last long, and the darkness will devour us too, Sister Theresa said quietly, guessing her thoughts. Fine, she said sharply. Don't hesitate and embark on your journey immediately. Take Sister Helena to lead you through the mist and protect her with your life. Whatever happens, I need to have her back, she said in the serious tone of a leader. Roland and Theresa bowed to Sister in command and took their leave. Roland met the two sisters just by the gate. They were bidding their goodbyes to the others, hugging and giggling. This scene seemed so natural and pure that it made the young knight smile. He took his smile with him while approaching his new companions. Both of them wore dark coats. "Oh, there you are!" Helena exclaimed joyfully. "Here, put it on," she said while handing him a coat identical to one that both of them had hanging from their shoulders. "What's it for?" Roland asked politely while putting it on. "For protection. We discussed this matter briefly and agreed that we'll have to go through the dark fog. Without a light. Roland felt as if someone slapped him hard with that sentence. What do you mean, sister? Without a light? Without any light at all, she said calmly, as only she could say those words. I will lead us through a darkness with a light that I keep by my own heart. But we need to stay covered. Creatures of the darkness are hunting for light like ours. It will draw them to us immediately. You will have to trust me. Grab my hand, and I will lead us to the caverns. Roland couldn't deny that it did sound rational. In the end, even if forces of darkness were preparing their assault on the castle, they still might have been spotted by their scouts. Vengeful spirits never rest in the end. I will do as you say, sister, Roland said, and she smiled wonderfully. You better not smile while we walk, for that your smile is brighter than 100 candles lit in the dark, cold night. Roland thought to himself and did his best to hide the blush on his cheeks. He did well, at least he thought so. The time had come for them to go. The gates opened, and the three heroes entered the sea of darkness, waiting for them at the edge of the castle. Roland held Helena's hand, and Theresa held his. The priestess before him seemed to be incredibly confident while walking through this dark realm. Roland could not even see their hands intertwined together. They walked in total silence. Or at least silent as one can be while wearing armor as heavy as 2 knights carry. They walked like that for a while with a single incident. It's dead out here, Roland thought to himself and smiled at his own joke. Jokes didn't happen to him often. Surprisingly enough, their journey was wearing and boring. But finally, they did reach the caverns. Roland realized that when the sound of clattering metal started echoing. Those caverns were supposed to lead to the other side of the mountain range, where the source of this darkness was to be found, according to Helena at least, that could sense it way stronger than anybody else. Roland was surprised that a journey like that was taking this long and forcing them to rest along the way. But maybe it made sense. After all, they walked slowly and carefully, and that takes time. They stopped, leaned their backs on a cold wall, and sat in silence. While chewing dried horse meat, Roland thought about how he was going to fall asleep in a place like that. That had to happen in the end. He took watch as the first one, after, by whispering to each other, all three decided that it was a good time to rest. Then, Roland found the answer to his puzzle. He was not able to fall asleep at all. While staring at pure darkness, he never woke his companions to take the watch for him to be able to rest. Instead, he sat, alert like a cat beside a mouse hole, and watched. What he might have vaguely felt, but did not comprehend fully at that time, the darkness also stared back at him. When both ladies woke up, neither of them bothered to ask Roland about him staying awake all night. In fact, he couldn't help but wonder how they were able to fall asleep at all. Almost without a word, they got up, shared some water, and went back on their way. It was amazing, almost stunning in a weird way, how dense the darkness embracing this place was. Deep as they were into the caverns, almost no sunlight gets there anyway. And yet, it was so much darker than the darkest cave Roland had ever seen. It was as if the blackness of the starless night could get denser, heavier, and stirred into the air, almost impenetrable, and the quietude of the place. Sometimes you could hear rocks moving against each other, or larger insects running across, or the sound of water dripping. But these could be counted as exceptions. Most of the journey had been as quiet as Roland's meditation at Northern Peak. But this experience taught Roland something different. He learned that there is more than one type of silence. This silence, dark magic cavern silence, wasn't peaceful and refreshing. This silence was the very opposite of freedom. It was dreadful, bloodthirsty, and, putting it simply, frightening. There were no enemies around. It looked like that, at least, that could detect them. It was darkness itself that, with its cold touch, penetrated their armors and hearts and squeezed the life force out of their bodies. But Roland tried to let those thoughts go too, as he learned during his meditation practice. He struggled with them bombarding him from every possible direction until, gently, he was brought back to the present moment. It was a squeeze, not strong, but firm. It was Helena that squeezed his hand harder. She stopped. Both he and Theresa breathed slower to give their ears a chance to investigate the problematic nature of the matter of stopping and Helena's fright. Roland edged a little closer to her. He couldn't help but notice the very pleasant scent of the young woman's body while doing so, yet he did not concentrate on it. "What is happening?" he whispered as quietly as he could, only moving his lips as much as was required, speaking with words coming out of his mouth gentler than the breath of a sleeping man. She replied, but he couldn't hear. He got even closer. His nose almost touched the back of her head. Now he heard her. Goosebumps sprang up over his skin. "There is a man," she whispered, "before us." Her voice was frightened. Roland thought about a scared-to-death little mouse, knowing that her time has come to go down a hungry cat's throat. "Is he human?" Roland whispered. "Yes, he's breathing. He watches me." Again, a dreadful silence filled their souls. Theresa, certainly not hearing a single word that had been spoken, followed her instinct and grabbed the hilt of her sword, not pulling it out, though. Not yet. "He's large and strong and filled with awful anger." She uttered her words very carefully, obviously struggling with pronunciation. Was it fear that stood in the way of her words, or the low volume she was forced to speak in? It easily could have been both. "Scared," she whispered, as if about to cry. Now Roland grabbed the hilt of his sword. His heart was beating louder than Helena's words. He was ready to protect her and slay whoever was in the way. But then she repeated her words, and he heard her right this time. "He's scared," she whispered. "He's very scared." A few moments of unsure silence passed, and then a strong, deep voice cut the silence in half with a great thrust of his cry. "I want light!" The voice said so loudly that echo of his words pierced Roland few seconds after they had been uttered. "It's dark, I'm scared!" Suddenly, Helena let go of Roland's hand and approached the voice. "Helena!" Roland cried after her while trying to be as quiet as possible. Theresa did not wait. "Let your light lead me in my time of need." She finished her prayer and her glowing sword illuminated the cave. It was exactly what they planned to avoid, but also the only way out of the situation, considering that their seer, Helena, was not there to lead them anymore. What they saw left them stunned. She was embracing a giant ogre, holding his head in her arms. A monstrosity vaguely similar to a human being cried and wept and murmured something that they could not hear. There. Dark is away, all is good now." Her angelic voice kept repeating, and her words seemed to be like a lullaby to the ogre. Roland learned about various creatures as a part of his training. Paladins are not monster hunters. That was about to change in Roland's future, yet at that point nobody could have seen it coming, but they ought to know what entities there are to be met in the world. And as he had never met an ogre before, all that he had learned about these creatures seemed to stand in total opposite to his current experience. A crying ogre that was scared of darkness, lost in a cave, right now lying on the ground being cuddled by a priestess of coal, was not something he would ever believe. To be radically honest, that was not an experience he was planning to share with anyone for the same reason. "Stay away, Helena," Roland said firmly. His face was harsh and his look serious. "He is dangerous." "That's what you've been taught," Helena cried. "Get that poisonous image out of your head. Wipe those superstitions out of your mind. How many orcs do you know, Roland?" He drew his sword that glowed immediately, with no prayer being spoken. Theresa gave him a shocked look. That, in fact, even surprised Roland, but he ignored it and took it as a sign that his actions were indeed noble. He interpreted it as Cole's support of his cause. "Step back, Helena. You don't know what you're dealing with." "And you claim that you do for some reason? Because you're a knight and you believe unconditionally in what we have been taught." "Leave her alone," Theresa hissed at Roland. Roland ignored her but noticed her reaction. "The knowledge passed to knights has its origin and has proved its worth throughout centuries. I will spare an ogre, if that will please you, my lady." He got closer to them and realized that the ogre wasn't crying anymore. His blunt face just stared at him, covered in tears sliding on his cheeks, and he held Helena a little bit too strongly. "But you have to trust me and come to me." "That's enough!" Theresa shouted behind Roland's back. That forced him to turn around. "Leave her alone!" "Sword, sister," Roland said quietly. "Our mission is our duty. This beast cannot be trusted. We must not become weak, for our weakness will bring us doom." "The ogre is now ours," she hissed. "He is strong and stupid. We could use him." "So that's what this is all about?" Roland asked, deeply surprised. "Is it not about empathy, but vengeance? You do not care about this ogre just as much as you don't care about Helena either," Roland shouted in wrath. "You care only about a taste of blood in your mouth." "Our mission is to spill blood," Theresa exclaimed harshly, almost savagely. "And if Sister Helena can control him, it is only to our advantage against the necromancers." "What makes you think that she can?" Roland couldn't hide his anger anymore. "You found a crying bag of meat and got weak and myopic. This is what Soul Sisters are. either too soft or too savage to become real knights. That was way too much. Roland felt that upon uttering those words. He even regretted saying so before he managed to reach the end of the last sentence, for he didn't really believe any of it. He believed in the opposite. He respected Sword Sisters, and he admired each of them way more than any knight, or, even more, any overseer he had ever met in his life. But the words spilled from an angry heart that desired nothing else but to destroy. And this lack of discipline that Roland usually did not suffer from brought sad destruction into the dark caverns under the mountain range. Theresa screamed and swung her blade towards Roland's face. He dodged her blow at the very last possible second. Then he struck her and she managed to parry him, pushing him back with a loud grunt. Roland was aware that Theresa was more sinewy than any other Sword Sister. Hell, she might have been stronger than him. That's why he knew that he had to fight differently. Usually, he fought just like every other knight, holding his ground, hiding behind his shield, and striking hard when the opportunity arose. That was what Theresa seemed to expect, because now she attacked him almost mindlessly. She swung one blow after another, trying to break his shield and tire him out. Then, to her genuine surprise, Roland parried one of her blows strongly and rolled on the ground, like a mercenary or a thief would, this way avoiding another blow completely. Theresa almost collapsed, not encountering any resistance, and then she felt a cold steel touching her neck gently. She stood still, disoriented for a second, and then she dropped her sword. The duel was over shortly after it started. "You won, Sir Roland, and my life is yours," she whispered in anger that was so overwhelming that Roland could almost feel it, like you can feel the power of a storm about to strike. "You fought with honor, and your life may be kept." He took away his sword, endangering her neck. She picked up her own from the ground and gave Roland her savage look, but also filled with respect. That's at least what Roland thought. "Have it your way, knight," she said much more calmly than before. "I forgive you, your attitude." Roland bowed before her. He would have explained how he was sorry for his behavior, say everything he thought and felt about Sword Sisters and how much he respected them. But he never had a chance. Suddenly, Theresa was grabbed by an angry ogre and he threw her against the wall. She grunted, her hair turned red, and she passed out. Paladins have a very close-minded approach to life. For them, every situation is a test of their strength and faith. But this thought pattern made them stronger than most of the other warriors. Roland's mind was not concerned with his own death or pain. Fear did not take control over him as he watched Theresa's body flying in the air like a bag of potatoes being carelessly thrown on a stall on a marketplace. He did not even blink when the massive ogre stood right before him, ready to do the same to him. He focused on his hand wielding a sword that glowed in the golden light. He saw a massive beast before him, almost twice his size, that eliminated the biggest Sword Sister he had ever saw in his life with one blow, and he was about to suffer a similar fate. But none of it mattered. Serving Cole was his faith and strength, and if his fate would be to die in this cave, then so be it. A paladin has to do what he has to do. And deep in his heart, Roland felt like a paladin already. The beast raised its massive hand and swung it way faster than Roland expected. He managed to jump back and avoid the blow. Using this opportunity, he tried to pierce its hand with his sword, but then another fist approached him, and he had just enough time to recover behind his shield. That saved his life, but broke his arm. And broke his shield as well. Roland flew a few meters back, finding himself on the ground with an arm so broken that he couldn't raise himself back up by using it. He pounded his sword into the ground with his good arm and managed to climb back on his feet by leaning on it. The ogre had no plans of stopping, though. They did not have a sense of honor, and this one did not hesitate to strike while Roland still wasn't able to fight. Roland rolled on the ground to avoid being crushed. Rolling wasn't his style at all. His heavy armor did not make it easy for him either. His rolls were slow, and he wasn't able to roll far, but far enough away to dodge the beast's fury. Close enough, though, to experience the ground literally shaking around him. Then he looked at Helena. In all this commotion, he managed to completely forget about her. She was standing too far for the light of his blade to not be able to reach her. She stood still with her face covered in the darkness of the hood. The priestess didn't react to the fight that was occurring. There was no screaming or crying. She just simply stood, watching Roland facing his death after her other companion, her sister, lay already dead. Then Roland realized what needed to be done. He rushed towards her. Big Ogre's legs were larger, but fat, and Roland could be swift as well as strong. He reached Helena, grabbed her from behind, and held his sword against her throat. "Step back, beast, or she will die!" Roland screamed, and the ogre seemed to understand, because it stopped, completely stunned by the situation. Roland held Helena's body, but it felt awfully cold. And she smelled of... It was difficult to describe, but one thing was certain. It was not a pleasant scent at all, and was unlike anything else Roland had ever experienced in his life. But if he would have to compare, he would look for examples of the smell on a battlefield or graveyard. "Turn around and go away!" Roland screamed. As much as he was concerned about the priestess, he still had to deal with an ogre and couldn't lose his leverage. The ogre started babbling something, but there was no way to understand what he might mean. He was really pissed off, and that was enough for Roland. "Come back to Ash!" Theresa screamed, jumping to his throat and piercing it through. Then she fell, not having the strength even to stand, as if all her life force was transferred into this action. The ogre grabbed the blade, and his hand was covered in its own blood. He flounced sideways, grunted quietly, and then, finally, he collapsed to the ground, just next to Theresa, that didn't seem to move either. The sword that had been glowing all this time now started to fade away. It was only a moment, 2 blinks of an eye maybe, and then the cold, stinking body of Helena vanished. Just like that. Roland found himself embracing the coat she had been dressed in, now covered in a tone of ash that was so cold it almost burned. He threw the coat aside and ran to Theresa. Her mouth and eyes were filled with blood, and it was clear that these were her final moments. "It is an honor to die by your side, knight," she uttered with great effort. Roland held her hand and served her with his presence in her last moments. A few breaths passed, then she exhaled, but her chest did not rise up again. It grew awfully quiet. Roland knelt by Theresa's body, lost in his thoughts. He looked at the coat laying on the ground and to the giant ogre that had been hiding in a cave. Strange place to choose when you try to hide from darkness, Roland thought. But then it occurred to him that maybe it wasn't just darkness he tried to escape from. It was the darkness that he did not know. In that case, the ogre chose a place that was also dark, but he hoped to find the darkness there was that he was at least familiar with. It did not work. Foul magic was strong enough to soften him up. He fell for Helena's lie like a 3-year-old baby, the light he had to sense somehow deep inside of her. Helena. It was clear to Roland that he was lured into this cave. He and Theresa had to die. And as for Helena, she either was never been a real priestess or was kidnapped and swapped by some witch that impersonated her. That would explain how easily she cured Roland's wound. Being adept in dark magic, she also knew certain tricks how to fight with it. That would also explain why she would know how to walk in the darkness so well, and why they never really got attacked. But the light inside her was real. Roland felt it. Other sisters felt it too. Even an ogre whining in a cave did. And a true light cannot be fabricated. Roland had a ton of questions, but no time. He knew that there might be no path leading to the other side of these mountains, and even if so, he wouldn't expect any necromancer's source of power there. His mission was lost, his mind deluded, and he had only one choice. He had to go back to Irwich Castle and help defend it for as long as he could. He got up and was ready to leave, but then he looked back at Theresa. Sudden grief overwhelmed him. He sighed to himself and went back to her to take her armor off. After doing so, very gently, he pierced her heart. "I can't let them recruit you," he whispered. "I can't give you the satisfaction of having a second chance against me." Roland managed to get out of the caves. As he got closer to the exit, he thought he could see something, and then, upon approaching it, he was certain. It was bright outside. No dark clouds in the sky, no dense fog dwelling in the land. Birds were singing, and the wind danced around the boughs and through the treetops. "So it is over," he said to himself while covering his eyes that were unadjusted to such bright light. "We either won, or we lost." He said those words as if trying to take care of someone, cheer the other heart. But, in fact, he did know what happened. He certainly wasn't a scholar of dark magic, or any kind of magic for that matter, but he knew what the end fight against the necromancers looked like. If they would truly lose, the whole land would be recovering for weeks after their presence, especially in the face of a force as powerful as that. But this did not happen. Instead, everything looks totally untouched. It could only mean that they struck, got what they wanted, and vanished while covering their tracks. Roland found a path leading to the castle, which happened to be a lot closer than he imagined it to be. The gates were open, and not a single person guarded the wall. That only made him certain that he was right. He went into the courtyard and still didn't see anyone. Only the pile of corpses that the Sword Sisters burned reminded him of any human presence in this place. He walked through the corridors, across the throne room, and even checked the prison. No one was there. But even more than that, there was no sign of a fight anywhere. Roland wandered aimlessly for some time until he finally arrived back at the bed he woke up on not that long ago, greeted by the angelic voice of Priestess Helena. Apparently, happened to be an undead servant instead. He lay down, willing to fall into his sorrow, but then he noticed. He got up and pulled down a note that was fixed to the ceiling with a rusty dagger directly above his head. The message was short, but Roland read it several times over and over again, not understanding what it was about. Strange emotions grew inside him, a mix of anger and fear. It read, "I couldn't let you die, Sir Roland. There is a great potential in you." The note wasn't signed with a name or even a letter. Roland sat on a bed with his tiny piece of paper, not knowing what to think about it. He didn't understand what happened or what he was dealing with, but he knew one thing that he started to doubt in during his retreat on the northern peak. His destiny was indeed to become a holy warrior, a paladin, a blade of coal, and spend his whole life fighting with undead evil. Filled with grief, but powered by the hunger of revenge, he embarked on his journey back home. He had a tale to tell, and this he was so entirely sure of, a great war to prepare for. Thank you for listening to this story. As this podcast launched a month ago, I realized that there are very few that actually stumbled upon it, but every download is a source of joy for me. So, if you're listening to those words, you ought to know that you are among the few, and I am very grateful for you to stay with me. We will hear from each other 2 weeks from now, and I will bring another story. This time with a whole trio, embarking on another quest for Oriel. Have a great time being you, my friend, for you are the stars and night sky embracing it.